Well, earlier this week we told you about the dozen trans prisoners with convictions for violence or sexual crimes who've been moved to women's prisons in Scotland. It's happened over the last year and a half or so, and some campaigners are pretty unhappy about it. Of the 12, 11 self-identify as women, but they are biologically male. This is the sort of thing which got Jo Phoenix into hot water. Who's she? Well, Professor Phoenix is a criminologist at the Open University. She's taking the university to an employment tribunal. The professor claims she was bullied for suggesting that male-bodied prisoners should not be allowed into female prisons. A lot of people seem to think she has a point. She's managed to raise something like £80,000 in crowdfunding to bring that particular case. Well, joining me now, Brendan O'Neill from Spiked. Brendan, thanks so much for joining us on a Friday evening when you'd probably prefer to be outside watching fireworks with everybody else. I wondered, just before we get on to Professor Phoenix, if you just caught the end or the whole part of my interview with George Galloway there, and anything which particularly made your ears prick up, whether it was about maybe the free speech dynamics of Twitter or what he feels is the draconian manifesto of the SNP in Scotland. I mean, he remains a deeply engaging, at times almost hypnotic speaker, but is he talking any sense?
I think he's talking a lot of sense, yes. And I think the SNP has become an incredibly authoritarian party. They've turned Scotland into a kind of tin pot tyranny. In many ways, it's the most authoritarian country in Western Europe, I think. You mentioned the named persons scheme, where the plan was that every child would have a social worker or a member of the state looking after them. That kind of fell apart eventually. They've also tried to ban certain chanting at football matches. There's the hate speech law. It really is a party that doesn't trust the Scottish people and wants to control almost every aspect of their lives. It's striking that the SNP would argue for independence while not trusting the people who it wants to be independent. So I think George Galloway makes a lot of sensible, correct points about the dangerous road that Scotland is going down under SNP rule.
It's not a road so very dissimilar from the rest of the UK when it comes to the rights or otherwise of people who've transitioned or even transitioned from one gender to another in terms of where they are accommodated within the criminal justice system. I mentioned those dozen prisoners, 11 of whom were simply self-identifying in Scotland. So I'm biologically a man, but I'm saying I'm a woman, and therefore I will be transferred to a women's prison, even though I've got convictions for violence, and that may involve sexual violence. You can see why that's leaving some female prisoners fairly traumatised.
Oh, absolutely. I think the idea that a biological male, some of whom have committed sexual offences, the idea that they should be housed in women's prisons, which are institutions full of vulnerable women at the lowest ebb of their lives, women who are very often victims of circumstance, I think that is just such a horrific suggestion. And I think most people would recognise that that was a horrific idea. I think it really is the nadir of woke campaigning, this idea that anyone who says they are a woman must be taken seriously, even a criminal, even a sexual offender, even potentially a rapist. So there's something deeply objectionable about the idea that men should be housed in women's prisons. And I think it does suggest that some elements of the trans movement have really lost their way and have really lost touch with morality.
And Professor Phoenix, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, you know far more about it, Brendan, than I do, but it seems to me that she's been in quotes, bullied. She says she's been bullied for saying really what you just said to me.
Well, that's exactly the problem. You know, that it seems to me that lots of women who raise these concerns, lots of women in academia in particular, there's also Kathleen Stock at Sussex University, who was hounded out simply for believing in biological sex. Lots of women get treated appallingly if they argue that women need certain sex-based rights, and if they argue that women need their own spaces in which biological males should not be allowed to enter. Those women are treated really terribly. They are often no-platformed, they're censored, they're hounded, they're called every misogynistic name under the sun. So there's an element of misogyny, I think, to a certain wing of the trans movement. I've argued before that transgender campaigning looks like misogyny in drag, because it does end up hounding women, demonizing women, and punishing women simply for saying that women need certain rights. So what's happening to Jo Phoenix, the way she is now being hounded by elements of the trans movement, I think that really is a sign of the times, and it's become a risky business for women to say we need our own spaces and men should not be allowed in.
Brendan O'Neill, good to talk to you as ever.